Hello from London. Oh, you can't bring me all the way over here and not say hello. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's funny, we were talking backstage about that question, and I said, you know, sometimes the perception of the English National Health Service is that we're like the Chinese army, you know, kind of 1.6 million people marching together. And I am going to talk about people marching together, but in a very different way, to a very different beat. So, hello, my name is Kathryn Perera, and I work with the National Health Service in England. I'm also, I'll confess at the start, a recovering lawyer. I've been recovering for about 7 years now. I used to practice law as a barrister, so the full wig, gown, robes, collar, in London, advocating on behalf of clients. I think it's quite telling that in preparing this talk, I wasn't able to find a single photo of me dressed in my courtroom outfit. Probably tells you something about how I felt about the whole setup. But when I qualified as a barrister, it was a moment of immense pride for my family. Achievement, right? I have a long line. My family's Irish Catholic on both sides, and we have a long and illustrious line of men becoming judges and barristers. So when I left university, it seemed like the obvious choice in some ways. But the person who inspires me most in my family is my grandmother. Her name was Nan McGonigal. She was terrifying, 5'2", tiny woman. She was an Ulster woman, so she grew up in what became Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And in the 1930s, she was one of the first women to study law at university. And she graduated in the top tier in law in the whole of Ireland. And she worked her whole life as a legal secretary because no one would employ her because she was a woman and a Catholic. And I've known that story since before I remember hearing it for the first time, so it was in my blood. So when I graduated as a lawyer, it wasn't just a job, it was deeply personal. And it felt to me like righting a wrong. I started practicing law. I practiced discrimination law, equal pay. I represented women who'd been sacked when they were pregnant. I represented trade unions, some members of parliament. That was interesting. I also represented banks, government. And the more I did the work, the more I felt something deep in my gut. And it was a feeling that I couldn't really shake, that something wasn't quite right. You know, I'd been trained to think and behave like this. But more and more, I found myself thinking and feeling like this. And I remember the case that broke me, or as I now think of it, the case that woke me up. I was instructed by a bank to go to court and to represent them. They had sacked a woman in circumstances which, when I read the papers, looked pretty shoddy, but technically, legally, wasn't against the law. I rocked up in the courtroom with my wig and my gown, and there's a small woman sat in the waiting room, and I realized that this is her. Now, of course, she's lost her job, so she doesn't have legal representation of her own. So I sit with her, and we get to talking. And she tells me how she's lost her home because she couldn't afford the mortgage payments anymore. How she lost her marriage because of the situation that she was in. How she was being treated for depression. And how she had asked the bank to pay her £1,000, about $1,400, in recognition of her claim, and that she would go away. And rather than pay her £1,000, they paid me £1,000 to go to court and get her claim knocked out on a technicality, which is what I did. So I'm sitting in this waiting room with this woman, and I'm explaining to her what is about to happen. And she smiles at me, and she reaches across, puts her hand on my knee, and she says, "It's okay. It's okay. You are just doing your job." And you know, nearly a decade later, that moment still catches me because I took it as a sign of a need to wake up. You know, who amongst us wants to be just doing our jobs? You know, who comes into healthcare so that we can just do our job? Very few. I think we come in because we have a sense of purpose, and we want to build a sense of shared purpose with other people, a sense that we can make a change. And perhaps for many of us at some point, that gets lost. Next year, the National Health Service in England will be celebrating its 70th birthday. And it will also be 70 years since the World Health Organization defined health not simply as the absence of disease or infirmity, but as a state of well-being, physical, mental, psychological, spiritual, and yes, social well-being. But we face deep challenges in making that definition a reality. And I'm going to just talk about 3 of those challenges very briefly. First, how do we optimize quality of life now that we have relative quantity? Second, how do we cope in a liquid world when it feels like everything is changing so fast? Third challenge. The great management thinker Henry Mintzberg said recently that the greatest danger in healthcare is not micromanaging, it's macro-leading. Macro-leading. An obsessive setting of strategies and vision with little understanding or investment in the consequences. Look familiar? I think that all of these challenges have a common connector. And that connector is, how do we maintain connection? How do we maintain a relationship with purpose when the world around us feels like it is moving so fast? When I left the courtroom that day, I went back to my chambers, I sat down, and I wrote a letter of resignation. And it began a 7-year process for me of trying to reconnect with my purpose. I trained in community organising in North London. I started organising in Brixton in London with a group of young women to make our streets safer, to campaign for safer nights out. We built an organisation that trained community organisers in the north of England. We worked with teams of young women who had experienced domestic abuse to compel decision makers to put more resources into prevention rather than papering over the cracks of the problems that they faced in their lives. And through that work, I learned a lot about power. I learned about how we take what we have to get what we need in order to achieve what we want. And I learned that the most transformative power in public services, in healthcare, is the power of relationships. How we grow them, how we use them, how they change what we do and why. So I became interested, in other words, in movements. And we started building movements around these issues. And I know that they are movements because to this day they move without me. Movements can teach us so much about how we catalyze energy for change, how we pull people in, how we re-remember the values that made us do what we do and not do what we don't do. And I want you to think for a moment about the most powerful movements in your tradition, wherever you come from, and what you can learn from them. Because if they're like our tradition, then they have at various times taught us that poverty makes us sick, that bad housing kills us, and that one small act of kindness can transform another person and can transform us too. Okay? And at their most powerful, they stir up what the great activist Keir Hardie called a divine discontent with wrong. Movements teach us how to access our moral outrage in order to make a change. So when I joined the NHS, I had one question. How do I take all of this stuff that I've learned through working in communities, and how do we harness a movement approach to transform a system? So it's distinct from looking at how do we run it like a movement. I don't want my healthcare run like a movement when I go into A&E. I want someone who knows what they're doing to do what they need to do. But I think there are some insights from the ways that movements are run and the mindset used to approach people and power, which are powerful for thinking about the future of healthcare. So I want to ground it in two concrete examples. The team I work in is called NHS Horizons. We are a small but kind of beautifully formed team of 12 people. And we decided to take on a couple of challenges. The first challenge was this. In a big system, which is based predominantly on plan and deliver, which has a strong culture of targets, how do we harness some of the energy of a call to action in order to catalyze transformation in culture across the NHS? And how do we do that using an approach which is less like a program and more like a platform? More about giving people space to pull in their own energy for ideas. So 5 years ago, we founded an initiative called NHS Change Day. And it was a very simple idea. Could we create one day of collective action across the NHS that would be the biggest day in its history for quality improvement? So we put out a call to action across the health service. And we did this deliberately at a senior level, at a frontline level, through management, through people who care about the NHS, which is basically everyone, as well as people who worked in. And we asked people on one day simply to pledge for an action, a concrete action they would take to support and transform the NHS. By the second year, we had more than 800,000 pledges made in one day of action. And it was the biggest movement of people creating quality improvement in a day in our history. From that, the response was overwhelming. And what we heard most was, how do I get the confidence to do this stuff on a bigger scale? How do I learn and develop the capacity to do it with others? So we took the same approach, and we launched a school, a massive open online course, a MOOC for those of you who are 30 and under. I had to learn this stuff. Yeah? So it's a true NHS product, the School for Change Agents. It is free at the point of use for everyone. We run it every year, and it is 5 modules that draw in the latest thinking and expertise and concepts around how do we make a change that starts with me, that moves to us, a change that teaches me how I roll with resistance rather than trying to punch through it. We do modules on concrete examples of how to make it happen with tools and methodologies. And we work with people to think about how they move beyond the edge, not just rocking the boat, but staying in it, and hopefully transforming the boat as we go. From both of these examples, we developed some insights into how the world is changing and what this might mean for the future of healthcare. And I want to just share briefly 3 of those with you. The first one is this. If you ask any activist, how do you understand the world? She will tell you, look for power. Understand who has it and how it's shifting. One of the biggest things we've seen in the world, and we saw this through our work, is how power and our understanding of it is shifting in the world. Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms, whose book will be published next year, talk about a phenomenon of new power, Give you one small example. How is it that one company, without owning a single foot of real estate, has been able to radically disrupt the entire hotel industry, Airbnb? I'm not saying that these are forces for good or bad, but I do think it's an interesting idea to explore the balance of power, the way that we use it, and how it's shifting from a single to many model to a many to many experience, and how that's affecting our experience as consumers, as citizens, and what we expect of our healthcare, I think will be a force that radically disrupts healthcare in the future. Second insight was that we need to think more creatively about our people. You know, if you take a movement approach to people, then you understand that people who have drive and ideas are on every street, in every workplace, every hospital, and often they are waiting to be discovered. But what they need is for someone to reach out, to call them to be not just spectators or props or consumers, but to be players in public life. And a movement approach would say that the people who do that are leaders and organizers. So there's something about how we think about leadership that I feel is shifting through our work. The final one is about agency. So those of us who work in healthcare improvement are largely comfortable of thinking about agency as my ability to act, my sense of my own self-efficacy. We talk about self-care, patient activation measures. And all of these are interesting and can be important, but they start from an individual perspective of agency. I believe that one of the most powerful forces of transformation in healthcare in the next 50 years will be when we learn how to harness better collective agency. So not simply me having more power in my individual life to affect a change, but how we do that together with a common purpose and what that means for the way in which we design healthcare systems. Central to that question of collective agency is narrative, stories, and stories run like a thread through movements. Possibly the greatest stories that we have about the law in England are the great stories of Sherlock Holmes. And I want to end by sharing with you a quote. There's a wonderful line in The Hound of the Baskervilles when Sherlock Holmes is speaking with Watson. And he says to Watson, and he means this as an insult, he says, "Watson, you will never be luminous. But every so often, you are a conductor of light." So let's think today, together. How do we get better at conducting the light? Thank you.